Welcome back to Cognitive Linguistics. Today we will talk about perception, attention and viewpoint. Usually, we very often think that we experience the world and that our perception of it is a direct reflection, and this is then passed on to cognition. As cognitive psychology shows us, however, our perception is highly selective. We don't always spot everything that's in our view. And something that is equally important is our viewpoint, how much attention we pay to certain things and how we look at specific scenes. In today's session, we will see that this is reflected in language, that the way we construe a certain scene tells us something about our attention and our viewpoint. Let's start with a classic psychological experiment from Simmons and Chabris. I've given you the link in the description and also in this video, and I would ask you to click this first. Please pause this video, click on the link and do the test. So did you spot the black gorilla? Well, almost half of the people watching the video don't. And that's got something to do with selective attention and our cognitive biases. Selective attention means that we don't always register everything that we see. Despite the fact that we're under the illusion that the visual input that we get from our vision is sort of unfiltered, our cognition already, unbeknownst to us, filters our experience. If we're focusing on one scene, like for example the passes of the white team in the gorilla video, then we're blind to change. This is called change blindness. So a change to objects and scenes often go undetected. At the same time, if we're not geared towards something, if we don't expect it, then there's going to be inattentional blindness. We very often don't spot the unexpected. As Simmons and Chabris in their originally studied state, we perceive and remember only those objects and details that receive focused attention. So let's focus your attention a bit more. Here's a whodunit video. Again, I'm going to give you the link in the description. It's on YouTube. Please click on it and do the test. The main point here is whether you can find out who committed the murder. So were you able to guess the murderer? And on top of that, did you spot the 21 changes? When I saw the video for the first time, I hardly spotted any. The reason for this is that I was so focused on the murder plot, that I was so focused on the scene, geared by my expectations, by the frame of, let's say, Agatha Christie novels, that you wanted to find out, well, are there any clues as to who might have killed the poor victim? So as you can see, perception is sometimes misleading. And as this scene shows, eyewitness statements are sometimes probably not as reliable as people think they are. Now, how is all of this reflected in language? Well, a crucial term here is construal, because how people perceive a scene crucially also influences how they talk about it, how they construe it. Let me illustrate this with another classic story. This is the Pair Stories project by William Chafe. And as you will see, if you click the link here, it's a very long, almost silent movie that's only got background noise because no one is really talking, about someone picking pears and then what happens to the pears. The thing is, Chafe used this in order to elicit linguistic data from people. So he had the subjects watch the movie and then retell it. And as it turns out, their stories differed crucially. Their construal of their scenes betrayed that they had a different centre of attention, that they focused on different elements. Here's just a very short clip to illustrate this point. Okay, as you can see, it's not the most exciting of movies. But how would you describe the scene that you've just seen? So once he'd come down the ladder. Well, as it turned out, different people had different construals of this scene. One speaker said, and he dropped them into his thing. Another speaker said, picks the pears and puts them in these baskets that he has. The next speaker said filled with, and he's filling them with pears. Another person said, and putting them in a white apron. Still another speaker said, and then he'll stuff them in that. And he put them in an apron that he had. Another speaker told the story in the following way, but he also had an apron on and he was filling those up. Now, of course, some of these descriptions share similar things. Some of the speakers mention the pears, others mention the apron, and others sort of focus on the basket. But even if they focus on the same object, they use different verbs. So speaker 5, for example, said that he's filling the baskets, whereas speaker 10 says he's stuffing them. Speaker 12 is more neutral, and he said he put them in an apron. And the last speaker said he was filling those baskets up. So you can see sort of that different zoom, a different perspective. In one sense, you sort of focus more on the basket as it is filling up. On the other hand, you focus on the protagonist who's sort of putting the pears into the basket. Now, all of these descriptions are equally true. None of these is better than the others, but they show you how even in the description of the very same scene, people use different linguistic expressions. They use a different construal to express their center of attention, and thus express their center of attention. Let's look at another example. This is a classic cartoon, and you see there's a fish following two guys, and the one guy gets angry about this and starts throwing punches, and then the little fish cries and the big fish come round. So for this scene, you could say the guy is punching the fish, or you could construe it in a way where you make the fish the subject of the sentence. So you say the fish is punched by the guy, or the fish gets punched by the guy. And finally, you could use a clef construction. It's the bigger guy that punches the fish, which would of course imply, as you may have noticed, that it's the bigger guy and not the smaller one. So choice of constructions always implicitly gives away our center of attention, our construal of a scene, our perspective. Some linguistic items also have a very specific construal on the same kind of situation. Think about yesterday, tomorrow, and the next day. Langecker illustrates this with the terms vantage point and reference point. Your vantage point is the location from which you view a scene. So in physical terms, if you actually view something, it's where you are centered, where you're looking from at a scene. Linguistically, the corresponding expression for this would be today or now. That would be the deictic center from which you could talk about today or tomorrow. So what you see for yesterday is that the vantage point is on one day, but your zoom, your immediate scope, what you focus on is the day before that. So vantage point is today, and if you use yesterday, you shift the focus of attention to the day before. Similarly, in tomorrow, obviously the immediate scope is the day after today. So your vantage point is still today, now, but your scope, you zoom in on the following day. And the next day is just slightly complicated in that you don't use today as your vantage point, but you've got a vantage point outside of this, but you've got a new reference point. So the next day he arrived uses as a reference point a day in the past. Similarly, a term like roof is actually a construal of the top part of a building. And if you want to explain what a roof is, well, it's something that is on top of a building. So the focused element, your scope of attention, is of course the top part, but you still picture the bottom part of the building. Similarly, if you think about the term week, a week is of course 7 days. That's a very specific construal of time, because normally the way we see it is one day follows another. Then we've arbitrarily decided in our cultures that the 7-day group should be called a week. And then you zoom in on a succession of 7 days. Despite the fact that, of course, every day follows another one. So after every Sunday, there's another Monday. And finally, if you think about terms like husband and wife, relational opposites, then you can see that they, in both cases, presuppose that you've got two elements, a husband and a wife, and there's a relationship between them which Langecker indicates by a bidirectional arrow. And the fact that they are objects is indicated by a circle. But the two circles differ in prominence. In husband, you got the relationship between husband and wife, but you focus on the male part, on the husband. Whereas if you talk about the wife, you zoom in on the wife, and that's your immediate scope. So again, using either of these terms is a specific construal of this relationship. Look at the following scene. You see a sky, you see sun, and clouds. And again, you've got multiple ways of talking about this. Some speakers might say the sun is above the clouds. Others might focus on the clouds and say the clouds are below the sun. Both of these statements are true, but what differs is again your construal, your viewpoint on this scene. Here we've got Langecker's description of above and below. As you see, there's a vertical axis, and above and below obviously imply that something is higher or lower, so that there are at least two objects which you relate to each other, and one is higher on a scale. An object in Langecker's description is a simple circle, and as you can see, one is above the other on this vertical plane. The only difference now is that if I say above, the sun is above the clouds, I focus on the element that is on the top level. This is abbreviated as trajector, and the other part is called landmark. So the trajector is sort of the thing that you focus on, and the landmark is the background against which you look at it. If, on the other hand, you zoom in on the clouds, if those are your center of attention, and then you say they are below the sun. Now the clouds are the trajector, and the background is the sun. So trajector and landmark in this way can be seen as something like a zoom of your scope. What do I focus my attention on? Is it the sun or is it the clouds? And the various linguistic expressions, prepositions such as above or below, allow you to express this viewpoint. Okay, let's think a bit about gestures. Very briefly look at this scene of a cheetah. You can see it walks to the left, and then it walks to the right. Now, if you ask people to tell that scene to someone who maybe wasn't at the zoo to see the cheetah, they will do one or two things, as McNeill has pointed out. Either they adopt an observer's viewpoint, and they would gesture when they speak, and they would say, oh, the cheetah, it was looking for something, it was walking left to right. So I use my fingers to indicate how, from my observer's viewpoint, looking at the cheetah, it was moving from here to there. And this is something that people very often do when they tell a scene. They adopt an observer viewpoint and basically with their hands gesture what happened in their visual field, so that the other person, because of embodiment and simulation, can picture the scene. At the same time, some people, on the other hand, will adopt a character viewpoint. So that means they will reenact what the cheetah was doing. So they might be doing something like, well, the cheetah was sort of slowly walking to one edge and then it was going the other way. As you can see, what I'm doing now is I'm sort of embodying the cheetah. I'm pretending to be the cheetah. And that also works because now you're looking at me and you as an observer see me as the cheetah. And that also helps you to simulate the scene. So character viewpoint or observer viewpoint are two important different ways of how we express certain scenes. And this again has very important effects also when it comes to psycholinguistic studies. Remember the baseball experiment? So where the baseball is bigger first and then gets smaller? Bergen and his colleagues asked a new question. So is there a difference between the observer viewpoint if you hear the pitcher hurled the softball to the catcher, or the character viewpoint, you hurled the softball to the catcher? Now think about it. From the bigger to smaller representation that you get on the screen, what kind of viewpoint seems to be implied? So it's bigger, and then it gets smaller. If you said character viewpoint, then you're right, because it looks as if the ball gets smaller from your point of view. So you're not picturing the scene as if the ball is going left to right, but as if it's going away from you. And if you simulate that with respect to your embodied cognition, then you would expect that 5, you hurled the softball to the catcher, the character viewpoint, gives you faster reactions because it's already primed than the observer viewpoint, the pitcher hurled the softball to the catcher. And again, this is exactly what Bergen found. So in scenes where the character viewpoint is triggered by the linguistic input, you also react more quickly to a scene that fits this. Now, viewpoint is not something that is static. It can also shift throughout a narration. This is an example that Danziger discussed in detail in 2005. Jonathan Raban is an author, and in All Glory he recounts the following story. He went on a tour with his boat, and the TV news reported on this. And this is him then talking about this. So here we go. The TV news went local. An Englishman had left Minneapolis that day in a small motorboat. In the picture on the screen, his face had a cheesy pallor. He looked to me like a clowning greenhorn. Did you notice how subtly the viewpoint changed? At first it's just descriptive. An observer's viewpoint, the TV news went local. This is about the time that this was aired. Then we shift the viewpoint to the actual TV news. So now Raban recounts what the news was about. An Englishman had left Minneapolis. Then he shifts to the picture on the screen. So that's him watching himself in the TV news. And then he gives you his view on himself as he looked on screen. He looked to me like a clowning greenhorn. And very effortlessly, people are able to understand this and jump from one viewpoint to another, which just shows you how embedded and embodied the whole thing is. As a final example, let's look at some literary work. This is an analysis of Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias by Stockwell, which I'm quickly going to read out to you now. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I hope you will agree that this is a very vivid poem that conjures up lots of images. But what it also does very cleverly is change your viewpoint. So it starts out with a first-person narrator, with a lyrical eye. I met a traveller. So this is our viewpoint. We've got a character viewpoint of the narrator. Then he shifts to an observer viewpoint because he meets a traveller. And this traveller then starts talking about his experiences. So now we're already taken from one place in time to another place in time, to a previous place in time where this traveller was in some kind of desert. The traveller then goes on to talk about the desert and what he found there. Ruins mostly. The remains of a big, intimidating statue. And now very cleverly, when we go to the line of what's on the pedestal, you suddenly get another I narrator, but you're not confused. You don't think this is the I narrator from the very first line or the traveller. You know that this is what the pedestal says, and you can shift the viewpoint to this King of Kings that's no longer there, that was already sort of long dead by the time that the traveller had come to the desert. And you hear about this Ozymandias. And he addresses his people. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. So you get 3 different people. The I narrator at the start, the traveller, Ozymandias, 2 different places, one somewhere that's unspecified, and then this desert. You get different times in the desert, so the now, where there's only the remains of the statue back to the time when it was built. And you can see how very cleverly we are able to shift our viewpoint and to embody the different scenes. How are we able to do this? Well, A lot of important neurological work has been carried out on mirror neurons. So it turns out that in higher apes, if they picture a scene, so that would be an observer's viewpoint, they activate the same kind of motor neurons that they would use if they were reenacting the scene themselves. And this actually shows how you can get from an observer's viewpoint to a character viewpoint, because you can embody the scene, because you can picture yourself doing what you see. Now in humans, this ability seems to be even more advanced, and we've got an advanced theory of mind. We know, or at least we learn as little children at a very fast pace, that what we have in our minds is not what another person knows. Maybe you've heard about the classic experiment where there's two boxes and an experimenter, together with a kid and another adult, hides a toy in one of the boxes. Then the second adult leaves the room. The experimenter takes the doll from one box, puts it into another box, and asks the kid, well, if this other person comes back and I ask them in which box is the toy, what do you think they're going to point to? And young kids are going to point to the box where the toy is now in, but already after 3, 4, 5 years, kids learn that this other person hasn't seen that the toy got from one box to the other. So they know that these people have a different state of mind. They have a theory of mind that the other person who didn't see what they saw couldn't know the same thing. And they will say, well, they will probably still think the toy is in the first box. Okay, so theory of mind, together with joint attention, is crucial for language development. Joint attention means that by gazing in a certain direction, a toddler and an adult will know that they're both attending to the same thing. So joint attention must be established. And the more we learn language, the more linguistic constructions we have at our disposal to coordinate attention, to give different views on the same scene. The clouds are under the sun is over the sky, and we can direct people, we can direct our listeners towards our interpretation, towards our construal of a scene. So summing up, perception isn't the full picture of the world. You don't just take in everything that you see. Instead, it is influenced by attention and by cognitive biases. Construal, then, is our linguistic expression of viewpoint. And as we've seen, many linguistic expressions exist that allow us to frame the very same scene in multiple ways. Okay, so much for our discussion of attention and viewpoint. Next session, we're going to move on to categorization. Thank you very much for your attention.